Okay, so let's get into topic one. The crisis in Europe and American entry into World War II. Okay, so the topic question is: was US involvement inevitable? Okay, and so we'll have 5 lessons to answer that question. Lesson one will be Germany in the wake of World War One. Lesson two, Europe and Asia before World War II. Lesson three, the US before World War II. Lesson four, Japan reacts to the US. And then lesson five, the US enters World War II. Okay, a date which will live in infamy. And so after those 5 lessons, we'll have a short DBQ essay. These essays are to be short as if they were going to be written during a class period at school. Okay, so this is not a research paper or a term paper or an essay to freak out about, or one that will count as a huge portion of your grade. Um, you need to be writing and often. And so we will have a short DBQ essay, and I'll talk more about that as we get into it. So let's look at the question: was US involvement in World War II inevitable? Okay, so as I stated before, the first step to understand the question is to look at the terms. We will discuss different levels of involvement as the US enters the war, but the term we need to define here is inevitable. So, what is inevitable? Something that's certain to happen and something that's unavoidable. So, what makes something inevitable? So, in other words, the question we are looking to answer can be asked this way: could the US have avoided involvement in World War II? So, was it inevitable? Was it unavoidable? Or could it have been avoided? In order to answer this compelling question, we need to first understand what events led to the start of World War II. As we learned in the second unit, the origins of World War II are connected to World War I. So let's briefly review how the end of World War I impacted the beginning of World War II. If you'll remember, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that was signed with Germany in the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919, of course, was the conference at the end of World War I, where many, many people and countries came together. Many treaties were signed, many territory changes were made. The League of Nations um, was introduced by Wilson, of course, the US president, even though the US never entered the League. Um, but in the Treaty of Versailles, uh, Germans really resented this, and they were humiliated for the 4 main points of the treaty, and that started with war guilt. Germany was assigned full blame, for starting the war, and thus responsible for all damages. Okay, and so not only were they humiliated from a pride standpoint for being responsible for this war, where they also lost a lot, they were also then assigned these burdensome reparations. Okay, and reparations, of course, was lots and lots of money um, to pay for the destruction in France and Britain, and um, it it hurt the Germans. Uh, to compound the problem of the normal burden of having to pay extra at this time, on top of their own recovery from the war, there was a global economic crisis, a downturn, the Great Depression, which we also hit on last semester. In the US, started by the stock market crash, but this had ripple effects around the world. So to pay, the German government printed more money, and this flooded the economy with so much currency that it caused what's called hyperinflation. Um, so the normal German every German was affected by these reparations. This wasn't just a big tax that the government was paying or the military was paying. This was something felt by every German because hyperinflation made their money not worth anything, right? Hyperinflation made, the stick of gum cost $1,000. And so maybe you had $1,000, but you can't buy anything with it now. Okay. And so also they had limitations put on their military. They couldn't have uh, more than 100,000 men. They were limited to productions that they could make. They couldn't have an air force anymore, no more U-boats. And then lastly, they lost territory. Okay, so we had war guilt, reparations, limits put on their military, and then loss of territory in parts of Poland, colonies in Asia and in the Pacific and in Africa, and then also the Alsace-Lorraine, the territory between Germany and France that was disputed after World War One. So here we have a cartoon from a British newspaper in 1925. So this is even before the economic crisis. This is to show the humiliation that Germans felt just by the loss of territory and the war guilt, right? And so you can see the German boy in the corner standing on the stool with the dunce cap on, asking the teacher, right, the League of Nations, please, miss, I have learnt their lesson. May I get down? Right? So they're humiliated. They're stuck in the corner with their nose against the wall, while the rest of the countries sit in the class and snicker and laugh at them. And so that's kind of how they felt on the global stage, was that they were being mocked and humiliated. When in reality, they lost soldiers and they lost lives and they lost territory and had destruction in their country also. They felt, especially targeted and humiliated, to say it one more time. Okay, so here we have a political cartoon from a German newspaper. And we're going to walk through together the document analysis, historical document analysis strategy called HIP. Okay, so that's HIPP, which stands for H for historical context, I for intended audience, P for point of view, and P for purpose. Okay, so HIPP. You can always find these resources on how to do this in my teacher folder, and there's always links to that. You should be able to get to that. If you can't get to my teacher folder, you need to let me know that so I can tell you. Okay, so the first part of this, there's two resources in the teacher folder. One spells out the HIP and questions to ask yourself for each portion. And the other one talks about different types of documents. Okay, and so this is a political cartoon from a newspaper. So for cartoons, it says, look at the captions, look at the title. Okay, this one, the title and the captions are in German. Okay, but we're going to translate them together and talk about it. Who are the characters in the cartoon? Do they look realistic or exaggerated? What are their expressions? Are the characters or the objects labeled? Are there other symbols present that you can identify? And just what's the overall impression of the cartoon? Okay, so if you know nothing else and you can't translate anything in this cartoon, you can look at it and say the overall impression is that guy looks worried about what's going on. Okay, and so who is that? And what's going on are the next questions. So let's go into our other document to kind of walk us through. So we're looking for H, the historical context. What's the historical context of this? Well, we were just talking about hyperinflation in Germany printing money. Okay. We're looking at the title. This says Gutenberg and his billions is what that translates to. It looks like million, but it's for billion in German. Gutenberg and his millions. Well, who's Gutenberg? Gutenberg, if you know your world history, was the inventor of the printing press, right? Which made mass printing even possible in the first place. Of course, it was, you know, invented and originally used for mass printing of the Bible, not money, but he was German, and so that's what the cartoonist is using here is Gutenberg printing billions, and being worried about it. Now the caption at the bottom says, um, I didn't mean for this. This isn't what I meant. Something like that. Okay, so if we're looking at the historical context, it's the hyperinflation in Germany prior to World War II. So that's our historical context. What specifically is going on at the time? What's happened? It's the time between the war. It's a global depression. Is the document a reaction to some event? Yes. And what specifically is that? Okay. So if I'm filling out my HIP analysis, I'm going to write down H for historical context and say something like, following the Great Depression and the weight of war reparations, Germany flooded their country with extra printed money, causing hyperinflation, right? That's the one big sentence. If I'm just taking notes, I'm going to write down Germany, hyperinflation, Great Depression, reparations. Okay, so moving on to the I, we have intended audience. Okay, and so our reference sheet says, to whom is this piece directed? Who's it for? Who's supposed to see this? Does it identify a certain person or a group of persons that the author expects to inform or influence? Okay, all we see is Gutenberg, and we see hands reaching at the bottom of the screen. At the corner of the cartoon are there certain people targeted? How might this affect the reliability? Is it appealing to certain people? I would say this is printed in a newspaper, meaning, probably everybody didn't read the newspaper and it's directed at those who did. It's directed towards maybe the people responsible for printing the extra money to say, hey, we don't think this is a good idea. Hey, German people reading this newspaper, this is the author speaking, of course. This isn't working out for you, right? And maybe you should say, hey, your government has handled this badly. Okay. So for the intended audience, I would say that this is for people in a position to influence government or to possibly change it, right? This is a government position of printing money that is, hurting people, and that's the message being conveyed. Okay, and so that brings us to the next part of the analysis, which is point of view. Okay, and this is, what's the author's tone? Does the author have a bias? It's without knowing the author, and we could do research to find it out maybe. We don't know that. But what's the main idea? What's the idea that this was bad and that people are unhappy with it and that it's harming the general public? What point is the author trying to make? Right? What's the tone? If we knew that this was an agitator on the outside trying to change the government, we would say that that's their bias. If we knew that this was somebody in the government who was, a dissident of what was going on, then we would know maybe that's the bias. You're not always going to have an answer to every question on the guidance sheet. So we have H as hyperinflation. We have intended audience as, maybe voters in Germany who could be changing the government, making these terrible decisions. We have the point of view of the author. We would say that the author has is criticizing the government for their actions that caused hyperinflation. Okay, so the point of view is that printing more money to pay for reparations wasn't working, right? And then purpose. What was the source for? And so this is related to point of view, but you really have to separate, um, you know, the purpose of the document from the point of view of the author. Okay. Uh, but in many cases, especially in your cartoons, they're going to be similar. So the point of view of this author is that this was a bad idea, and so the purpose was to convey that, was to criticize the government, was to discredit. So that was a little slow and grueling to walk through the HIP analysis, but that was our first one of the semester. And so we fly through a few more of those together as we go along, and you'll have to do some on your own as well. Um, Sometimes for the HIP analysis, I'll ask for a summary statement, and that's basically to sum up as much of that information as you could into one. What I say for the summary statement is to always use the historical analysis, the historical content part of the analysis as your intro for your summary statement, or the first sentence of your summary statement. Okay, you can't sum up this cartoon without talking about hyperinflation before World War II in Germany. That's what it's about. And then you can talk about, what the purpose is or what the point of view was. Add another detail to your summaries, to the historical context, to make it a more full summary of what you're seeing here. Okay? So for the summary statement here, I might say something like, under the weight of war reparations and a global economic crisis, Germany resorted to printing huge sums of money. The purpose of this cartoon is to criticize the German government for making the economic impact of this worse and causing hyperinflation and suffering for their citizens. Okay, that was a little rambling, but. And here's another cartoon that just kind of shows the weight that the German people were feeling. You can see that this is $55 billion. And that was back then. So, uh, huge sum of money. And that's how they felt, that they were being crushed under the weight of this debt that they had to pay after World War One. Okay, and here you see German children playing on the street, on the street, on the sidewalk, with huge stacks of cash. Okay, those are bundles of hundreds of dollars that they're just playing with as building blocks, because for them that's about what it was worth. It was like playing with a stack of pennies on the table. Um, Germans, they blame the Treaty of Versailles for this, and the West, specifically the US, France, and Britain, for all of their economic distress. So all Germans were suffering, and they blamed the West. Okay, now that we have explored some of the context of post war Germany, we can now explore the election in Germany in 1932. Okay, you do not need to write any of this down. This is giving more context to what was going on in Germany with the lead up to World War II. Okay, so in this exercise, we're going to look at different party platforms that Germans had to choose from in 1932. Okay, and so first, let's get into what's a party platform. Okay, it's a set of beliefs that are accepted as characteristics of a particular political party and presented to the public to help them pick uh, what the party stands for and who they want to vote for. Okay, so it's your statement to say, this is who we are and this is what we believe. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read through these three platforms, and I'm going to try to do it a little bit quickly just to give you an idea of the three main choices Germans had to make. Okay, so here is platform A. Okay, we are committed to the overthrow of the presently existing oppressive republic and all of its economic and social institutions. The party favors the abolition of private property. When property is not owned publicly, it cannot be distributed to those who are poor, cold, sick, or hungry. The establishment of land reform programs in which the government will take over the land and distribute it for the common good of all. Transfer of all industries to the government so that they can be operated for the benefit of all people. A foreign policy that will build friendly relations with Germany and the Soviet Union since we share interests. To the German people, the cause of your misery is the fact that the French, British, and American capitalists are exploiting German workers to get rich themselves. Germans unite and remove this terrible burden. Okay, so that is platform A. Okay, platform B. This party wishes to maintain the republic and to encourage Germany to make its place among the free governments of Europe. Okay, we support the present German Republic in which freedom, democracy, and justice live in the hearts of German countrymen. We will honor all of Germany's obligations, political and financial, in order that Germany's honor will increase in the eyes of the world. We plan to increase jobs through a program of public works. We will establish unemployment compensation for up to 6-month period. We will cut government expenditures to lower taxes. We believe that the right of those who disagree with the party to speak and write their opinions freely. Okay, so there is platform B. And platform C. We demand a union of all Germans to form a great Germany on the basis of self-determination of peoples. The abolition of the Treaty of Versailles, land and territory colonies for our surplus population, the requirement that all German citizens have German blood, non-citizens will live in Germany as foreigners only, subject to laws governing aliens. The vote will be allotted to citizens only, as will the privilege of holding office. If it becomes impossible for the motherland to feed the entire populations, aliens must be expelled. No further immigration of non-Germans will be allowed. Any non-German who arrived after April 2nd, 1914 shall leave immediately. A thorough reconstruction of our education system will ensue with the science of citizenship taught from grade 1. All newspapers must be published in German by German citizen owners. Okay, so 3 very different platforms. And to review, we've got one that's committed to the overthrow of the existing republic, one that wants to maintain the republic, and one that's demanding things. Okay, so platform A, no private property, reasoning of the West and exploiting German workers. Platform B talks about freedom and democracy and the freedom of speech and lowering spending and honoring obligations. And Platform C wants a union of all Germans, no more immigration, new civic education, everything in German, different laws for non-citizens, German blood for citizenship. So 3 pretty distinct parties to choose from in 1932. And now we've talked about the humiliations that Germans felt after the Treaty of Versailles. We've talked about the hyperinflation they were feeling, and just general resentment and humiliation between the wars. So now we're going to go and we're going to look at some biographies of actual voters from 1932. Okay, so this first guy, Otto, he works in a factory in Berlin. Um, he's got a trade union working for better conditions. The union would be more successful if the economy were not doing so poorly, but it's the union that's kept him employed. He worries about some of the ideas of his fellow workers, his fellow factory workers. Many think the only way to end the depression is to allow the government and workers to control the factories. But he believes that managing factories and the government should be left to those who understand those things, okay, and not just the workers to take over. Okay. Okay, so voter number 2 is Eric. He's the head of a factory and concerned about the depression. Um, he doesn't like the way that Germans were treated in the Treaty of Versailles and thinks they'd be better off without it. Germans are overtaxed and don't have money to buy his goods. Taxes wouldn't come down because of the reparations. Um, and he thinks that workers controlling factories and closer ties with the Soviet Union would be a threat to Germany, and fears Platform A because he wouldn't be able to compromise with unions. The workers would just be in charge, and they'd be subservient to the Russians, who had been an enemy before. Okay, so that's Eric. Dissatisfied Eric. Okay, and then we go to Carl. Carl's unemployed. He lives in a steel. Think of the old steel towns that are run down. He lost his job because of the depression, but he sees the factory owners are still rich. They live in their big houses and have their cars, and the workers are suffering, and yet the people at the top are still relatively okay. Um, he thinks that another government, a newer government, would be in a better position to, negotiate reparations again, to revisit negotiations. He thinks what's needed is a government more responsive to workers, right? This is the worker party again, perhaps run by workers, and convinced that Germany needs a government strong enough to stop the reparations. Okay, lastly, we have Hermann. He was a lieutenant in the army, and he fought in World War One. He was a graduate at the military academy. There haven't been promotions because they can't have as many soldiers, they can't have as many military leaders. And he thinks that he'd be a captain by now, maybe even a major, if not for the provisions of the treaty. And he also thought that it just did irreparable harm to Germany and Germany's honor and his honor personally as a soldier, right? This is the national pride. Okay, and so we have these 4 voters with different points of view. And if we look at this next slide, we see what the platforms were, right? A was the communists, B was the Democratic Party, right, to maintain the same republic, and C is the Nazis, right? And so we go back to our last 2 voters, right? Our military man, he was voting for Nazis, right? He wanted a stronger military and a more militaristic style government where him and his honor could be placed at the top. Okay. And then we look at Carl, and Carl was a man of the workers, right? He was a communist. He wanted he wanted government and the workers to take over the factories and to have a government run by the workers. You go to the first 2, and we've got Otto. He's the Republic guy. He thinks that it's a bad depression. If the economy were better, the unions would be better, the workers would be better off. we don't need a huge overthrow of the government to have things be better. We just need the economy to improve. And then we had Eric, who was the head of a factory. He didn't want the workers to take over, and he didn't want to maintain the status quo because Germans are being treated badly and the people don't have money to buy stuff. Okay, and so he thinks the best way to improve is to vote for the Nazis. So you can just see from this lesson overall that the effects of World War I were especially haunting to the people of Germany. So, to wrap up the first lesson of this topic 1 in 4.6, um, we go back to what was the aftermath of World War I for Germany. What was going on? And so what we've talked about was the humiliation felt after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, um, and just the humiliation of pride that most Germans felt. We talked about the crushing weight of war reparations, um, and that caused, the government to print more money. That caused hyperinflation that really affected everybody in the country, right on down, making their money worthless. Um, and all those conditions led to the division that we just looked at in this 1932 election, causing the people of Germany to split their votes between Democrats, communists, and Nazis. And so that's kind of where we are with the aftermath of World War I in Germany.